Hello everyone. Today I'm joined by a woman who is the Dean of Graduate Research and Professor of Cultural Studies at Flinders University, Australia. And you are Fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce, and Director of the Popular Culture Collective. She has previously held academic positions in the UK, New Zealand and Canada, won 6 teaching awards, published 17 books.
It's actually now 19.
19 books.
I had my 19th book accepted on Monday.
Wow, that's impressive. Written 200 refereed articles, contributed essays and opinion pieces on higher education and the arts, and your specialties include media literacies, doctoral education, higher education studies, creative industries, city imaging, knowledge economy, information management, information literacy, sonic media, auditory cultures, popular cultural studies, and the negotiation of cultural difference. That is quite a CV.
And I am thrilled to see you, Bruce. Thank you for coming all this way. I'm terribly excited to meet you.
Yes, well, I was very excited to talk to you as well, because I stumbled across your YouTube channel in my panicking about seeking PhD advice on YouTube, hoping that someone would supply their great wisdom. And I was delighted, of course, to come across your excellent channel.
Oh, you're very kind to me, and your timing is immaculate, because I think we've just released the 20th vlog, 200th
vlog, yes,
vlog on Sunday. So your timing is fantastic.
Yeah, I was watching that yesterday. It's interesting to see you sort of review your own vlog profile as it goes back. How long has it been you've been doing it now?
Well, we're just about to go to the 4th anniversary. So I'm almost at the anniversary of starting this job 4 years ago. So that's 2016. So we did configure the project as a learning-led project. So using the research that exists, and there wasn't much on what I call PhD media, but also on vlogs, disintermediation, deterritorialization, which you're also doing, and try to find a way to mobilize the new theory in an innovative way. So vlog 200, it was pretty appropriate to think, right, well, it is learning-led research. What have we learnt? So all sorts of people can go out into the universe, like you are, and transforming how we think about knowledge and audiences and how ideas move. Because all of this in ignorant times requires the clever people like your good self to share innovative ideas. That's the key.
Yeah, one of the reasons I've sort of started this podcasting is I've always noticed how there's sort of this disconnect between academia and the public, and there's this sort of amazing world of academics and knowledge that tends to only talk to itself.
Yes,
and the access to that from the public is very, very small or almost non-existent. And now with the sort of podcasting space, you get these 1 or 2 academics are starting to sort of expand and project and broadcast their knowledge and talk to people. So do you think that's a valuable thing, and how do you see that progressing as it sort of moves forward?
Oh, look, incredibly so. And I hope it's always been my politics. I've done a lot of work in journalism and in the journalism space, and I've been podcasting, I think, since 2008. So I've been a big believer in disseminating research in different ways. Before the word stakeholder gained much publicity, I was a big fan of engaging stakeholders. You know, we are funded by the public purse, by the taxpayer. Whatever country I'm in, it's funded by the taxpayer, and they have a right to read high quality stuff if they choose. So, but I would argue that's not necessarily a new idea. The wonderful Antonio Gramsci, who was imprisoned for his beliefs by Benito Mussolini in the fascist regime, he configured a term called the organic intellectual. And the organic intellectual not only had expertise in their area, so through peer review and talking to other scholars, but knew the area so well that they could translate that knowledge for whomever is interested. And for me, that's always what a good intellectual is. And I use the word academic, but I use the word intellectual for a reason, because we must be experts in our field, but we have a responsibility to transcend our field and change the world. And that's what academics should do.
I think there was a great quote from, I think it was Lawrence Fox, the actor, the other day, who said that his dad who was also an actor, had told him, always assume that your audience is more intelligent than you. And I think that's something that I think a lot of people, especially in the media, have been surprised at just how capable most audiences, or a lot of audiences are, of absorbing very long form, very high level content. And following it, rather than this sort of the classic stereotype of clickbaity 90-second clips and all this kind of thing.
Oh, that's right. And, you know, to use that great trope and cliche, we have got long tail media now. And what long tail media is, I call it disintermediation and deterritorialisation. But all sorts of very odd and quirky and interesting ideas on the far right and the far left and everything in between is available for people's consideration. And it is being used. And podcasts have existed, you know, we're now in the second decade really of podcasting. And they've renewed in their popularity in the last 3-4 years. And that's great, because they fit into people's lives. The great thing about podcasting is it whispers in the ear, hello everybody, whether they're on a walk or on a commute or on a train. And so that's great, because in those what used to be called dead spaces, innovative, fabulous ideas can emerge. So that's very exciting for me. And yes, clickbait can exist in that space, and the Kardashians can exist in that space, but so can you, and so can I. All of us, good scholars around the world, can infuse these dead spaces with ideas, not to agree with us in some sort of totalitarian configuration, but for people's consideration gently as they move through their life. And that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, it's the found time, isn't it? That's lots of people do it when they're running. I do it a lot when I'm driving, listening to things. And it's surprising to me how popular on-demand radio, which is effectively what podcasts are, actually has turned out to be.
iHeartRadio, for example, is tremendous for podcasts as well. All of us have our own YouTube or, in my case, lip sync channel. We have those, but then it can be repurposed through iHeartRadio as well. So we have our own radio station. That's tremendous.
You don't put yours out as just audio as well, do you?
Yes, I do.
Do you? Okay.
I do. I have, mind you, I do use them in bespoke functionality. I've done the vlogs. I've had a YouTube channel, I suppose, the Tara Brabazon YouTube channel, for about 6 or 7 years. The one for the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders has existed for 4. But as I said, I've been running podcasts a lot longer. I tend to argue, and you don't, and so I really respect what you're doing here, and I'm fascinated. I tend to configure different content for sound and for vision, because vision is very hot and, you know, has that certain high level of engagement. So I write stuff particularly for video, and the podcasts are more conversational and gentle and whispering in the ear. So I tend to differentiate content for both.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a value, I think, in the slightly more refined, scripted, planned podcasts. I think of someone like Sam Harris, who puts out a very well planned, very well scripted, often a monologue. As you do as well, rather than a conversation.
Yes.
And those, I think, exist almost as a separate space to the messier ones, which is partly what I consider this to be. It's just like a messy whatever conversation, more of the sort of Joe Rogan style kind of thing.
Yes, and I love them all. I think they all have an incredible place, and it's all about exploring ideas in different ways, and that's got to be a good thing. Yeah,
no, it's definitely true. And the same with the old radio stations as well. Like so many things like BBC podcasts are just old radio programs that used to be on at 2:10 on a Wednesday or something.
Yeah.
And now have a wider audience because of that access to them.
Oh, and that's tremendous too. It's about high quality content and then cutting up that high quality content for new audiences. And I love that. I mean, it used to be called Timeshifting. Sean Kubert wrote a book called Timeshifting about video, interestingly enough, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And that's what we all do now. It's about gentle time shifting of high quality content to suit the audience. And that's great.
And a lot of them I see, and you're a perfect example of this, seem to start out as a niche or very much designed for a specific audience of people, often a very small audience, but then gain wider traction as other people sort of dip into that space. I think I found this with your channel, that being an aspiring PhD student, let's say, whereas I guess you're aiming yours initially at your current students or at students around the world.
Oh, absolutely. This very much started, and I don't apologise for this, as you know from Vlog 200. It was very much aimed at 2 people in Tennant Creek. And I'm not sure if you know or your wonderful listeners know where Tennant Creek is, but it's a tiny little town in the Northern Territory where I think there's probably, with the greatest respect to our colleagues in Tennant Creek, I think about 4,000 people. And we have 2 PhD students from Flinders University in Tennant Creek, Melanie and Heather. We know them both. And so I was very conscious that the regional, rural and remote students in Australia, and it's a big place, were not being cared for, respected, or had media that would talk to them directly, and so the vlog became a way to do that. So it was never about audience numbers. It's never been about audience numbers. If I had one person that watched it, I'm cool. So as I said in that vlog 200, I am intentionally creating unpopular culture. I'm not dumbing this down. I'm not changing it to suit whatever people's interests. With the greatest respect, my students ask me to do something, I do it for them, and if anybody else finds it interesting, that's great. And of course now we're nearly at sort of 1 million people have found this interesting, and that's no one's more stunned than me.
Yeah, no, I think I'm very similar to you in that respect, that I sort of do it out of my own interest, not for any gain, any commercial gain or any professional gain or anything.
No.
It's that, to me, it's an excuse to have the conversations with the people with whom you can have the best conversations about wonderful. Whatever topic.
And that's just truly wonderful. That's brilliant. And don't you want life to be more like podcasting, really, where it is about intelligent conversations every day that challenge and transform and transcend? That we want life to be more like that.
Yeah. Well, it struck me that there were so many great conversations that I was having in the pub just with my mates, just over a few beers, just having a really deep conversation about all kinds of weird topics. And you just think, I wish I'd recorded that so that other people could listen to it.
Yeah.
And that's what I guess the space has discovered, that there's a massive audience for that kind of conversation.
Yeah, and that makes me happy, because with all the stuff that's happening with Murdoch Media and Fox News, not only in Australia, in the United Kingdom, you know, the Meghan issue that's going on at the moment, my goodness me. I mean, bad stuff is happening in the mainstream commercial media and in popular culture. Bad stuff is happening there. And we can complain about it, or we can create legitimate alternatives for people that want to live and think differently. And that's empowering and politically quite important, I think.
Yeah, it does seem the mainstream media is kind of stressing out and panicking about the space. And
they should be.
Yeah, but also on the other side, more and more people are being censored off the platforms that exist, like YouTube, like even this like Apple Podcasts and those kind of things, although they're arguably a bit more open.
Yeah.
Do you think, are we at risk of almost polluting the purity and the user-generated, anarchy of it by having corporate censorship to any degree?
That has concerned me. The only variable I've seen that's entered YouTube in the last little bit has obviously been the children protection and the child protection element. And look, I'm in favour of that. I'm, not anti-statist. I'm in favour of the state and I'm in favour of governance. But I mean the state too. I don't mean corporate interests. So I'm in favour of the state making decisions about citizenship. So I'm very comfortable with regulation, for example. And we look at what's happened without regulation, like the global financial crisis. I'm quite comfortable with regulation. What I'm not comfortable with are corporate interests determining what that regulation is. So, and that's why when I chose a podcatcher all those years ago, decades ago, I chose liberated syndication, which is where I put mine about and through, and millions of people do, because they had good lefty politics. They were quite stroppy and out there, and yes, they do feed iTunes, but they feed everything else as well. And so there was this independent, radical little group that feed the world. Great quality sound. And so it's about us making decisions about how we house our content. YouTube is working at the moment. It allows us to not corporatize and commercialize our content, and that's a great thing. If that changes, then we'll move on.
So here's an interesting philosophical point that I'm not entirely decided on yet. To what degree is it reasonable for platforms such as Google or YouTube to censor or not censor based on their own interests, versus to what degree should governments say you must censor on this basis or you must not censor on this basis? So should governments step in and say protect free speech to whatever degree on mass user platforms, and on the other side, should governments ever step in and say you're not allowed to have anything like this other than existing illegal content?
Look, it's a great question. And I'm not a libertarian. So there's extreme right libertarians, extreme left libertarian. I'm neither. I do believe in governance. As I said, I do believe in governance. I do believe in regulation, and they should be governed by the laws in a given place and time. So if it is about protection of children, and I'm a big believer in the rights of the child, if I can quote that major movement, and it is about protecting children, but also recognising the rights of children, because it's both, then I'm cool with that. So I am law-led. So what is the law in a given jurisdiction? And that law connotes the governance and the regulation. It's not arbitrary morality. I'm an atheist. I don't know what your particular religious variable is. Well. But yeah, I mean, there's no bloke in the sky with a beard. So it's not about, oh, this is my morality, get all that nonsense out. Ethics is different from morality. Law is different from religion. So separation of church and state, and the state relies on the legal infrastructure of its place and time to determine how it's regulated. What Rupert Murdoch thinks, I have zero interest. Okay. Zero, and he must not be allowed to be involved in any way, shape or form.
But would you add into that Mark Zuckerberg and the Google executives?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So would it be right to say that you think that the level of censorship on any mass user platform should match the existing laws of that state?
Yes, state, and hopefully create some sort of trans-local, transnational regulatory agreement, because obviously we're dealing with the internet, so it's always very difficult to regulate nationally. I get all of that, but we've got to start somewhere. And again, I'm not hugely in favour of restricting this or that or whatever, but I am in favour of us as a citizenry group deciding what is important to us, right? And that's determined via voting rights. That's determined about who's the government of a particular day, and we voted for them. So I'm in favour of that. But as you've rightly said, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or Google, these are corporate interests. So I'm not interested in money. I'm interested in law and the movement of law.
So that's interesting. So that doesn't go as far as obviously most of the platforms currently work, where they have their own internal policies, which aren't legal things.
No.
Things like, Twitter, if you dead name somebody, that you now get banned from Twitter, which obviously isn't a legal thing.
No.
But it's a policy thing. So you think that thing isn't reasonable, kind of thing is not reasonable?
I absolutely don't. And we all know, if we look at the example of the banking industry, that the banking industries and financial industries have only done that to stop the state regulating. So they create these little internal conversations with themselves, like Twitter is the world. Twitter is not the world, Twitter is Twitter. And they can, and of course they self-regulate to stop us regulating them through citizenship. So actually, I'm very happy for the state, transnational state. So, for example, if the UN becomes involved, as I hope they will, in these sort of transnational conversations about regulation, big fan. But what Twitter internally decides in the Twitterverse, zero bothers, because that is censorship, not attached to any legal undergirded foundation. And they're only doing it to stop other modes of regulation. So they're being left alone.
Yeah. Well, I have tried to struggle with this idea of should there be some kind of almost digital First Amendment style protection, or a threshold that says once you have a certain market share, you become digital, privately owned public space, and therefore certain protections exist, and you're not allowed to do certain things.
Well, you see, I mean, that's a good point. I wouldn't do that, and I'll listen to your argument about that. I think the moment we switch that recorder on and you upload it to the internet, it's public. Because it is public, whether one person listens to it or 5 million. So I'm not interested in the threshold argument. But for example, what I am interested in isn't the right word. Concerned about is, for example, hate speech. So that's where anti-vilification laws become important. So you can't say something to somebody else because quite rightly you will be sued. So I'm not a big freedom of speech, but we got the right to do anything you like. No, you don't, actually, because anti-vilification laws are in place. You can't libel or slander somebody because there's a law in place. So see how I sort of handle it? It's like, actually, I don't have the right to say any thought that hits my brain. As I'm speaking, I must self-manage and self-check and work out what is relevant and appropriate and ethically decent as the words come out of my mouth.
It seems kind of interesting that the digital space is discovering the old libel problems that the old newspapers, and I mean, you mentioned the Murdoch press, they have had to deal with that kind of thing for years and often have ended up on the wrong side of it.
Well, the Leveson Inquiry is a great example in the United Kingdom, quite rightly so. The appalling things that occurred in that space, whereby that dreadful circumstance where they were listening to messages on a dead girl's phone. That's an absolute disgrace. Going into the messages, whatever you think of the royal family, they have a right to have their message bank as private. So that's an absolute disgrace, and the Leveson Inquiry showed that.
Yeah. I mean, again, I go back to the distinction between what is legal in any given state and what is not. So, for example, somewhere like the UK now does have anti-hate speech laws.
Yes.
Whereas the US doesn't, of course. The US has the First Amendment. So then the disparity between US-based companies, which have very stringent hate speech policies, versus the actual law, which is much more free and saying you can say whatever you want.
Yes.
Would you then align on the side of the law and say that it's up to the state and therefore the democratic mechanism to decide what the appropriate level is rather than the corporate interest?
To manage that legality, and also then you get into civil and criminal law and all the rest of it. But those of us who are occupying this space, knowing that our audience is international, we have to look at the multi-phasic areas in which our content goes and look at what is appropriate. So I'm very, very aware that, not only my content and sound and vision, but also my publications have a big audience in Saudi Arabia. Hello to all my wonderful friends in Saudi Arabia. And that's magnificent. And, for some reason, I have a very large audience in the Middle East. So I'm therefore always very aware in the clothes that I wear and the words that I say that I will not intentionally be disrespectful to colleagues in the Middle East. So going into it, I'm not going to action hate speech in that area. I may agree or disagree with different jurisdictions, but I respect their right to regulate.
So, okay, let me play devil's advocate a little bit on that. Okay, so let's say you have an international audience, and obviously podcasts and things will have an international audience.
That's right.
And the degree of heterogeneity between different countries, culturally and religiously and socially and all these things, is so vast.
Yes.
Obviously, you can never keep everyone happy. You can never
That's right.
Align yourself. And if you sort of pick a lowest common denominator approach, you're not going to be able to do anything. Is it therefore more arguable that you should match your level of presentation or whatever it is to your country or your state, and then it's for other countries and audiences outside of your country to sort of appreciate that you are part of Australia or you're part of the UK or you're part of that and not judge you because of that?
And look, that's interesting. And firstly, just in legal terms, obviously this content is based in Australia. So in terms of legal jurisdiction, it is Australia. But my politics is translocal and international. So yes, I am an Australian, and trust me, this accent is not put on. Nobody could put this accent on, my goodness me. And I think that's important, that Australians are speaking to the world, and we have a right to do that. As a formerly, nay, currently colonised people, from your people, we have a right to answer back, and that's important. But there's something great and important as an intellectual, and particularly someone who's educating an incredibly internationally diverse group of students. I think we come from 66 countries at Flinders University in our PhD program, that I mustn't be xenophobic or insular or narrow and think that Australia is terribly important at all. It's a very, very minor nation at the base of the globe in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's very small, and it's important for me to open my eyes and open my ears and be respectful and decent with the views that exist around the world and learn. So when I get colleagues that are commenting about variables that I can do better, I listen to that, and that's important, and it keeps me learning, and that's great. So yes, Australia and Australian jurisdiction, and that's how the content exists. But be humble, be intellectually generous, and keep learning.
Have you found that, has anyone else within the universities you've worked in picked up on the sort of the idea of podcasting or the idea of video logging, whatever it is, and sort of been inspired directly from what you've been doing?
A lot of the students have, and a lot of our students at Flinders, for example, are about to start their own videos. Hello to Resh, about to start their own videos, and that's tremendous. As I talked about again in vlog 200, amazing, we're having this conversation a couple of days after I've released it. It was used for the RAE and the REF when I was in the United Kingdom. So it was used to tell the story of the research for stakeholders, and particularly through the REF, the podcasts were used to tell the impact and engagement narratives. So it was actually very institutionally important for colleagues to do that. And I think it was very useful. Remember, I was in a lot of media departments, so everybody had kit like you're using here. This is what we did for our day job. So it was a way to get people thinking about research, hard, difficult content in different ways. So yeah, a lot of my students have now ended up in the media, in the either formal media or doing the social media arm or work for large corporations. So that's where a lot of my students have ended up. And I think a lot of students are inspired to present their voice and their view to the world, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, I think accessibility is definitely the key benefit of all of this, isn't it? That you get such a wider range of people are then able to access content, even if it's things like recording lectures, like academic lectures, and then you get into whole arguments of, oh, if you're spreading it, then who's paying for it, and why is it reasonable to offer lectures for free, and all this kind of thing. But for me, it's very inspiring to see so many people actually spreading so much knowledge out there and allowing people to access it.
Yes.
But on the more academic side,
yes,
you obviously have very, very long involvement in academia.
I'm very old. Thank you so much for that, Bruce. Yes, I'm very old.
Not what I meant, but okay, thank
you. But yes, I'm very long, very, very long
very
time.
Experienced, very well qualified. So how have you seen academia changing over the last 10, 20 years, whatever it is?
What a question. Wow. So I was enrolled at the University of Western Australia in a history degree in 1987 and got my first full-time academic job in 1994. So this is a very long time. I'm 51, so there we go. Yes, I know I look like I've lived my life behind a train. I don't think so. But so what a great question that is. What an incredible question that is, and I've never been asked it. And the change has been absolutely astronomical, Bruce, because where it started, I was at the posh end of town, posh university, traditional history degree, specialising in European and British history. So that's where we were, the most traditional of disciplines and universities. And it was calmer, the work was easier, the work was of a lower order. Can I say the standards were high, so the students had to reach very, very high standards and not an inch was given. If you didn't come to a tutorial, there was no excuse. You missed it. No one cares. So it was ruthless, but very high standards expected. But for the staff, it was a much calmer environment. And there wasn't the separation, I'm talking 20, 25 years ago, there wasn't the separation of what's frequently called these days the academic manager. So the person who no longer taught and was no longer research active and just did management. Stanley Arnowitz wrote a whole book about this called The Knowledge Factory. And that book was published in the year 2000. So the separation of I'm happy to call it the core business of a university, teaching and research, from the people that manage teaching and research was, I think, the great nightmare, if I'm honest with you. And everything changed from that point, because then there was a disconnection from the people that ran the budgets, ran the timetable, organised the dough, organised the staffing, from the people that actually did the work. And the consequences of that in the last 15, 16 years have been astronomical. And, and that for me has been the enormous change. The massification of higher education commenced with Tony Blair. The widening participation agenda I'm a big fan of. So the people who are paying out of their taxpayers' dollars for universities, their kids are able to go. And so I'm a big fan of that. But where we got the widening participation agenda wrong was we didn't focus at the same time on the maintenance of standards. So the information scaffold, the academic literacies that we required to make sure everybody had a good fighting chance at the start. And I'm not saying kids from a working class background, which include me, kids from a working class background have lower standards, but often we were at schools where the teaching wasn't as good, and I'm prepared to just call it as I see it. And so that meant when we arrived at university, the gulf was a shock. And so some of us were able to suddenly, quickly gain those academic literacy skills and go, and some cannot. And that's not fair and reasonable. So therefore we need to, and a lot of the great teachers do, create that academic literacy, information literacy scaffold to ensure whatever background a student comes from, that they have every opportunity to succeed. Because access is not enough. Opportunity is not enough. the capacity to actually succeed is the key. And we've got a wonderful student, Narelle, who's doing work in the PhD program on that, particularly for science. So if students have come from rural, regional, remote environments in Australia, and I imagine it's the same in the United Kingdom, where the teaching confronts what we call a churn. So teachers are in and out of the school. So in terms of a science curriculum, the continuity is going to really matter. And so the students haven't got that. So they arrive in Physics 1 and have no idea what's going on and fail. And so we need to address that. So for me, they're the great changes: the managerial change, the massification change. And a lot hasn't changed. So we've only in Australia, 22% of professors in Australia are women. And I know certainly the case of academics of colour, male and female in the United Kingdom. Those rates in terms of the social diversity were poor 20 years ago, they're poor now. And so while we've had that massification of our undergraduate students, we haven't seen that move through the academic ranks in professorial posts right through to vice-chancellors. So some things have changed, some things have not.
I mean, this touches on a philosophical point that I've struggled with as well.
Yes.
A friend of mine works for the Access, the organisation that manages access to universities.
Excellent.
Fair access. So I get some insight into this.
Yes.
I'm not sure it's the role of the universities to make up for failings upstream of them necessarily. And this is the sort of big struggle. I think it's the obligation, as far as I'm concerned, should be on the schools and on the government who are sort of setting education and that kind of thing, to ensure that when people do then pass into university, they are at an equal level, that they have the same level of knowledge, the same level of confidence, the same standards, so there isn't a shock. And that if you have a sort of a fair system before you get to the university point, you then don't need to have any systems trying to make up for that later on. But I don't know whether that's an unrealistic sort of idea, and that maybe we do need other ways to get people in further downstream.
I mean, you're a rock star on that argument, and I do pay that argument. Two counters to it. The first one is at universities, and of course this was my job before this one, we teach education. We teach teacher education. So I was Professor of Education in my last job and Head of Teacher Education. So part of universities, a big part of a lot of universities, is that we teach primary, high school teachers, early childhood educators. That's what we do. So therefore standards matter a great deal in what we do at universities, because it impacts on how we teach 4-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 17-year-olds. So unless we get teacher education right, and it's going through an incredible period of controversy in the United Kingdom and in Australia at the moment, quite rightly, because clearly we're not getting things right in teacher education. And there are multiple causes for that in the profession, outside of the profession, in regulation, in government. And it's very easy to knock a teacher. When in doubt, if things are going wrong, blame a teacher. And of course, the research show that parental involvement in education, particularly in literacy, is actually far more important than anything a teacher does. So that's significant too. So the first thing is universities are invested in creating the benefit and the problem of what happens at primary, secondary and early childhood through teacher ed. But the second variable I think is important, because maybe I'm more depressed than you, is I would love to be able to say, and I taught first year students for 20 years, that, okay, first lecture, first year, this is the standard and sink or swim. And if you can't read at that level, bye. And part of me sort of loves that, and sort of a sadomasochistic, you either get it or you don't, or you're out, boom. I sort of love that. But also part of me is also horrified at that. And the reason being that, I went to one of those tough primary schools and high schools. I was the only person in my high school that made it to university. And also my parents, that are now 91 and 89, went to these tiny little country schools. And one of them was Northam, and Northam was a large but tiny school. My mother, just for our international listeners, my mother went to a school where the entire primary school was made up of 9 people, all of the different grades in primary school. one teacher. So I think we can pretend in our head that, oh, right, well, you can be at a primary school with one teacher, 9 students doing all the grades, and absolutely they'll get to the same standard as a private or your public school where, there's like 15 teachers, a specialist sport instructor, someone that does early childhood science, and, they will reach the same standard. Not going to happen. And so once you've realised that, well, that's just never going to, that equality, that equality of access, of opportunity is never going to happen. So once we're there, we have some choices. And the choices are hard ones, Bruce, because the choice is, well, you know what? Working class people are going to continue to pay for the education of middle class people, and they just got to deal with that because their students, their kids are just not going to make it. Or we can say, you know what? They have confronted multi-phasic injustice. And let's do something about that. And so what we do in first year classes, the best of first year teachers, is we scaffold multiple pathways through the content. Standards remain high, but we know we've got multiple abilities coming in, and those students that have come from the tough backgrounds have 13 weeks to gain those meta skills in reading, writing and thinking that they haven't got the previous 12 years.
Okay.
And so our job
it's almost
is to
like
take
a foundation year kind of thing, almost.
Look, it is, and it is, but it's more than that because it is proper first year university, but really doing the heavy lifting meta work, the andragogical work that requires academic literacy. So when you do assessment, I often call it, you create assessment that's completely different. It's cascading assessment, so smaller assessments that really scaffold to the next one, right? And huge, and that makes a real difference. So you just got to make a decision who you are and what's important to you. And if you want to run the tough thing where those in power continue to remain in power, then you assume, oh, right, well, everyone's coming to the university equally. If you believe in social justice and agitating power and changing our future, then we're going to have to transform first year in university. Yeah, maybe.
Well, I think you're right that sort of the idea of someone from maybe even like yourself from a background who has not been encouraged to fulfill their potential, the idea of not then helping that person to fulfill their maximum, sort of, I recoil at that. Obviously, you want to get the most out of people. Obviously, philosophically, the problem then is that by helping one person, you are by definition not helping another person who is coming on the same terms. And so I think it's right to try and help people, but you've got to be so careful about exactly how you design it and exactly how you do it.
Absolutely. And I was just going to say, so this requires absolutely the best curricular design you can do, which, my politics is everyone that teaches at university should have a teaching qualification. And I'm not talking about some sort of little graduate certificate or graduate diploma, that actually this requires, and everybody is helped. Absolutely everybody is helped because say you went to the posh end of town, there are a whole series of skills and abilities that you did not learn by going from the posh end of town. And that will hold you back in terms of life because life is not streamed. So there are different lessons for that group to learn. So when you create really that intricate andragogy and curricular design, everybody, whatever the inequality they come from, are able to lift to a certain benchmark level by the end of the first semester. That's the dream, and that's the great educator.
On that subject, the Harvard case of the Asian students who are sort of suing Harvard, I think, for negative discrimination.
Yeah.
What's your take on that kind of thing? Because that sort of seems to me as the result of what happens if you don't design these sorts of things very carefully and properly.
Correct, and that's the sad end of town, really, of the widening participation agenda. And the US university system, particularly the Ivy League, is a very challenging space because there is that sort of correction. So they're very aware that they kept letting in the powerful, and it perpetuated the issue. Then with pro-discrimination, which is a complicated area that I have very ambivalent feelings about, to be frank with you. You end up in a complicated zone there because, as I said, my point is not to dumb down the standards at all. So if you're letting crew in that can't do it, wow, that's a disaster too. So I'm not in favour of pro-discrimination. at all, to be frank. This is about standards, but it is about giving everyone who's managed to somehow pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get into a university, giving them a fair and equitable chance to get through. And then also making sure that the teachers, the academics, are not xenophobic. I mean, that's, the meeting I'm going to after you is about engaging Indigenous students and working with Indigenous students, having Indigenous research strategy, Indigenous higher degree students. So this is a positive, engaged, powerful space. So that's my greater worry. Does that sort of help a little bit? So I'm against pro-discrimination, but I'm in favour of university academics, university managers having a worldview that's not discriminatory. So seeing ability where ability is, rather than seeing it through the gauze of race.
Again, it's about that. To what extent is it, or should an organisation downstream attempt to make up for inequalities that happened upstream? So you might offer, say, a 13-week course to allow first years to get up to speed, but you might not offer a 3-year course because you might judge that to be unreasonable. And that there's a balance point of, this is the reasonable amount of time that we're going to allow people to to correct for anything that came before,
but I also think,
not more than that.
I mean, mate, I do also think that good curriculum is able to lift people wherever they find it throughout the degree. So I think we're talking about lifting standards. I think every human being that arrives in university has strengths and weaknesses. And what the best teachers are able to do, and the best robust curricula is able to do, is take the strengths and make them more fabulous, and take the weaknesses or challenges and correct them. And that's wherever you discover it on the way through. Because even in honours, in your end of your third year, end of our fourth year, you still discover, you never learnt how to do that. And that's from any background. You go, what? You never learnt how to reference a website? Really? And you're in honours, so therefore you teach that person and you move on.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can take it all the way back, I suppose, and say that the same argument applies to primary schools versus parenting. Like you'll always have differences in sort of the level of parenting involvement in how much do they encourage their kids to do X or Y. Indeed. And therefore, to what extent is it reasonable for the school to try and make up for that, and in what ways? And it's the same argument, really, isn't it? That universities are doing it for school leavers. And I suppose even you could say employers might even be doing it for university graduates.
Yes, well, let's hope not, and that's another debate. But I can say one of the great joys, some of the best scholars I know in the world, hi Yinka, some of the best scholars I know in the world are working in the early childhood space. So I think the most important teachers we have in the world are early childhood teachers, because they have the same role. I always compare early childhood teachers and those of us that supervise PhDs. I know they seem
what are you saying about PhD students?
Well, the extreme end of the universe. Well, it does require care and also, really complicated social environment. But early childhood educators have that same role, don't they? It's like whatever home life we all have, their task, responsibility, joy and challenge is to get those wonderful 3, 4, 5-year-olds ready for school. However they arrive, get them ready for grade 1. And how inspiring is that? So the best teachers are and should be in early childhood education, and they also should be paid the most.
Well, I think you're right. I think teachers should definitely be paid more. You mentioned number of people going to university, especially in the UK with the reforms that Ken Clarke did under Blair.
Yeah.
I had an interesting argument on a podcast, I can't remember which one, saying that was, basically the pendulum swung too far. That they went from 20%, whatever it was, up to about 45%.
Yes.
And that now we're seeing the problems associated with that, with academic inflation, with reduced standards, and with lots of unemployed graduates. So do you think there's sort of an optimum point of how many graduates there should be? And how do you think we're dealing with the sort of consequences of over-academization of a lot of people's lives?
I think that's a dreadful argument, and I think it's classist.
Okay.
I really do, because I think education is always productive. Education is always important. And because I am so much older than you, Bruce, I remember when people used to say, and still in my generation, let alone my mother's, where educating a woman, if you educate a woman, it's wasted because they'll just go and have babies. Now, my vagina is unoccupied and has been unoccupied. So I've paid tax every day of my life, and I've actually been in work every day of my life. So the assumption that, oh, well, look, if you educate a woman, she's just going to have a baby. And you still hear that now, actually, with medical degrees, where, oh, well, look, if you know, women, you spend all that money educating them to be a doctor or a vet or a dentist, and you know, they're just going to go and have babies. So that's the first thing. Education is never wasted. That's my premise. Now, if that's my premise, then men and women, our transgender, non-binary crew, are using their expertise to go into the world and make a difference. So it's like with PhD students, only 40% of PhD students remain in universities. The other 60% go into a myriad of fantastic fields and transform the world. Now, are we training too many PhD students because they don't end up in a university? Or is that actually a gift and a benefit because they're going into the world? So yes, the notion of degree inflation. So what, you used to be able to get a job at 15 to do this, and now you need an undergraduate degree. That's degree inflation, but to be frank with you, that person with the undergraduate degree is doing a better job because they know more. And the business is having to pay less for training, as we've seen around the world, because the R&D levels have gone down because they don't have to train the person because they're arriving with more skills. And the second point I would also raise about the widening participation agenda is everyone focuses on sort of the 18, 19, 20-year-olds, like they're the only people being educated. And the average starting age of my PhD students at Flinders is 36 years of age. And
that makes me feel young.
Indeed. And the widening participation agenda was about people who had never been given a chance, who had raised kids, had worked their guts out, could return to higher education after they'd given so much to their family, to their community, to the planet. They could actually return and have 3 years for themselves. And it's certainly not my place to say they don't deserve an opportunity to focus on themselves and see what they can do.
Yeah, no, I think it's fantastic that more people are coming in at an older age, and I think there should definitely be mechanisms and fair access mechanisms for that. I guess my argument is more at the other end, at the sort of school leavers end. And in the UK, we're having an expansion in the amount of technical education with the introduction of T-levels and more, I think, sort of access across paths between academic paths and technical paths and apprenticeships and this kind of thing. And I suppose that's the sort of the counterpoint do you think there are graduates who are going to university who don't necessarily need to go to university or perhaps aren't suited to it, who might be better off in a sort of a technical route or a straight to work route or an apprenticeship route?
Again, I will never limit somebody's education. So people want to be educated, that's tremendous. But I also have quite a conservative argument that I've had since I wrote a book called Digital Hemlock in 2002 that was, and the University of Google and Digital Dieting, these were books that affirmed the importance of higher education standards. So I very much believe in access, but as you can see in my politics, it starts there. And I believe very strongly that standards must not be dumbed down. So when we're starting to play with words like technical education and apprenticeship, this is higher education. So where I do get concerned, and I've put this in writing so it's no surprise, is I get very concerned about the blurring of FE, further education, and higher education. So in the Australian sector, it's often called TAFE. In the United Kingdom, it is FE and HE. And we've seen, particularly in Canada, United States less so, but I lived and worked in Canada, I have enormous respect of the Canadian system. It's a wonderful system. But in some areas, and we saw it particularly in Ontario, there was a blurring via legislation of the FE, further education and higher education. And I believe they are different things and the standards are different. So that merging worries me.
Is that because in an attempt to maintain the sort of the academic standards and the high standards of academia more than anything else, because it's such a different world almost to further education?
The university is a place apart with standards that have been historically handed down to us. So however else we handle curriculum, as I've said all the way through this conversation, the standards remain high. And FE is doing something different, and I have enormous respect for that difference. But those programs are not higher education, further and higher, those adjectives are meaningful.
Is there a distinction then to be drawn between graduate like research work and undergraduate like bachelor's degrees, in that one is a sort of a taught thing that you are being taught this is what you're learning, and yes, obviously you want to maintain academic standards, but perhaps there's a closer alignment between the 3-year taught degree in the UK, and a FE approach versus the sort of the academized PhD and graduate sector of higher education.
No, I'm a big believer in the undergraduate degree. As someone who's taught first years a long time, I have very clear understanding of what is the standard in a first year university system, and certainly FE can scaffold, because FE is one way to scaffold into higher education, but that's exactly right. It is scaffolding into, it is not equivalent. And so I'm a big believer in the undergraduate degree. And of course, a lot of them are, whether we're dealing with allied health education, a lot of it is applied knowledge, but it is still applied knowledge of a particular standard. So therefore, the movement into honours and master's coursework, research, or a PhD, it should be that gentle engagement. It should be that movement up, and the skills you get in first year loop back and are still relevant in a PhD.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. What would be your argument then to the assertion that there are too many unemployed graduates with degrees that no one wants to hire them for?
Right. I love that. I mean, for me, that's just bonkers. My argument is there are too many unemployed people. And there are multiple reasons for that, involving the fourth industrial revolution, involving robotics, involving automation, involving the decline of manufacture. There are multiphasic reasons for that. The gig economy, 0-hour contracts. Do I keep going? So the idea that having a large group of well-educated people, oh yes, that's the problem in the economy. That's the solution to the economy. That's a great thing. So we've got, what breaks my heart is we've got a large group of people that are underemployed. The underemployment is always what concerns me. So what we require is a plurality of meaningful work. And also, can I say, a plurality of meaningful leisure. We lose the word leisure a great deal as well. So I'm a big believer in thinking about life properly and its multiphasic glory and dynamism and agility. And I think the idea that, there were too many well-educated people. Yeah, you don't want clever people. You don't want clever people in a culture. Well, you do. And the people that are questioning the number of clever people in the country, I'd be watching them.
I definitely agree with you that having more clever people is a good thing. Here's one other counter argument to that.
Yes, please.
Do you think that maybe, like, say you graduate with a degree in something, a degree in anything, an undergraduate degree?
When in doubt, use media studies if you want the Mickey Mouse thing.
Media studies.
Because I used to be a professor of media studies at Brighton. Hi to everyone in Brighton.
You graduate with a degree in media studies, but there aren't necessarily enough jobs in media studies at related areas. But there are jobs in, I don't know, hospitality management or but then because you have a degree in something like, I have a degree, you then see that a non-degree requiring job is beneath you and you're less inclined to do it. Is that a valid argument?
Yeah, I think there are plenty of assumptions there that I'm not necessarily seeing. I think firstly, the notion that there's non-degree jobs these days I think is interesting, because if you've got a degree, you're in the top third of every job you're applying for. So that's the first thing, is we have labour surplus. We've got the workforce is changing. And because of that, we need fewer workers. Now, because we need fewer workers, the rules of labour surplus suggest if you're better educated, you're probably going to get one of those jobs, right? So try having left school at 15 and get a job against someone who's got a degree. Good luck with that. And the great thing about media studies, and I can say this as a former professor of media studies, who's trained people who are all heavily employed, doing incredibly well, including doing the social media work in hospitality industries, that actually the employability is fantastic. So that's what I laughed. We had an article in the Times Higher, I think a month ago, that we talked about media studies. And of course, they suddenly showed with some horror in the Times Higher Education that media studies graduates have a higher employability than vet studies graduates, because they've got the flexibility of mind. And of course, pick a business, every business you can think of requires someone with expertise in media. So that's why I always love it when people like bang on about media studies as a Mickey Mouse degree. Well, that one's getting people in hospitality, tourism, sports media management, sports law, on we go. Regional development.
And on the sort of the top end, there's been an increase, I think, in PhDs
Indeed.
over the last few years. What are the pros and cons? Well, what are the reasons for that, and what are the, other than academic inflation, and what are the pros and cons of that, do you think?
Yeah, and look, and of course, this is my bread and butter at the moment for the last 4 years. So absolutely, there then has been a proliferation of PhD students, an incredible increase. And what we've seen through that increase is, again, for the first time really in the last 4 or 5 years, the diversification of the sociology of the cohort coming in. So as I've said, we've got our average age is 36. We've got our younger crew that comes straight from a bachelor program and honours and come straight through, often on scholarship. So that's the conventional model of a PhD that used to be everybody. Now that's a relatively small cohort. That's certainly under a third. In some universities, it's under 20% of our students. We have that group. We then have, and this is the surprise for people, the group in their 30s and 40s who are often in allied health and education, but multiple businesses, who come back and do a PhD after being 20 years in the workforce to freshen themselves up, gain a PhD, and in education go on to, say, a headship or a principalship in allied health. They get a doctorate in physiotherapy, speech pathology, and they then become the head of their unit in a hospital. So there's that group that provides the impetus for the next stage of their career. We then have a group in their 60s that's often called the lifestyle doctorate, which is a bit pejorative but is fabulous, of people that have worked hard all their life and have an area of interest and do it in their 60s. And then we have this remarkable, wonderful, extraordinary group that I have the privilege of supervising these days that are over the age of 75 up to the age of 90. I love this group. These are my people. They are fantastic and they're still in work. And they're using the PhD to freshen themselves up. And I'll use Sue Charlton, my PhD student is now Dr. Charlton, as a great example of that. Physiotherapist, been a lifelong physiotherapist, transformed regional health, allied health, did a PhD, graduated at 77. She's
Wow.
still in work in regional Australia, still runs her own business, pays taxes, wonderful husband who's the GP in Mount Gambier. And she's got this incredible new lease on life. From the PhD, she's created 2 books and 10 refereed articles and is writing on a daily basis round her full-time work, creating a whole new career as a professional writer about regional health. And 77. So yes, the numbers are proliferating, but if you cut through those numbers and see the slices of the exciting people doing it and why, then you suddenly see the PhD is not one qualification, it's many.
Yeah, I suppose we'll see a massive increase in the contribution of those PhDs to knowledge generally as well. Especially since a lot of them won't go into traditional academic routes or professorships or the academic world, which is incredibly valuable, I think.
Oh, it's astounding. And it particularly will transform health and education, I think, because it means, and of course, as we've talked about, that's key, because it means we're in primary school and high school and we've got someone with a PhD who's the head or the principal in a regional town. So that's about knowledge and learning and standards, tremendous. And in regional, rural, remote health, and it exists in the United Kingdom as well, that commitment to quality, to excellence, to translocalism and fresh ideas in regional, rural, remote areas, it's worth anything. It'll save lives.
And my immediate thought then comes back to how do we get that knowledge out to more people and to improve the access? Do you do audio? Have you done audiobook versions of your books?
Look, I have. In fact, I did a vlog for my students so my students can start using audiobooks to get their PhD research out. I'm a big believer in it. Again, it's a very different audience, but it's important. So I've just released, in fact, it's out this week, I think, my second audiobook. So Trump Studies went on audiobook and it's done incredibly well. And Memories of the Future is a book that I'm looking at, sort of the nature of the humanities, that's actually out this week as an audiobook. The book that was accepted on Monday, the Creative PhD, will be the next audiobook that we'll record in the next month. So I actively encourage and I teach the PhD students at Flinders and our research master students to think about research dissemination in an incredibly broad way. So who's the audience you would like to reach? Think about the media interface and go for it. So it's about refereed articles, crucial, and I teach them how to do that. Scholarly monographs, incredibly important, teach them how to do that, but also podcasts, video, Twitter, pick something, Instagram. I'm now experimenting at the moment how we get high quality research out through Instagram. So it exists. Who's the audience? How can we reach it?
Yeah, well, I think it seems to me that more people are capable of listening to something than reading it. I mean, even personally, it's a lot easier to sort of listen to an hour of an audiobook in a car than it is to sit down and just read a book for an hour.
Yeah. And I think it's a different type of knowledge too. I mean, I'm a big reader and I'm a big audiobook listener. They're different vibes and they're both incredibly valuable and they're context specific. And as I said, it's about, and you engage with the ideas differently too. I think audiobooks are interesting in terms of you can immerse yourself in narrative and argument in a different way. So that's great. And the reading is that intensity of words and ideas and paragraphs. So that's great.
Yeah, they are definitely different mediums. You don't absorb it as well, I don't think, as an audiobook than you do.
Or it's different. I mean, the Open University did great research on this when they were using audio cassettes when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And they argued for abstract ideas. So philosophy, for example, PPE. For philosophy, for the abstract ideas, audio was magnificent because the idea would go in and it would settle and it would marinate and it would move and people would reflect on it in a different way.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, but obviously it wouldn't work so well for something like mathematics or something that requires notation and it's complex written things.
Look, absolutely, but again, we're sort of getting involved in that too for the empirical sciences, the lab-based sciences. Maths and engineering are different and wonderful, and big hi to all our maths and engineering crew, very precious to us. But it is important for the sciences, the empirical sciences, to think about those alternative modes of dissemination. Particularly, my beloved husband now, my current husband, Jamie Quinton, is a physicist, so we focus our mind a lot on that because obviously physics is in a very complicated space in higher education because it's the top end of town. It is probably, with the greatest respect, probably one of the hardest sciences. So how do we scaffold those students in? How do we proliferate and disseminate high quality, top end of town physics to a broad audience? So that as a problem is incredibly interesting.
Yeah, and well, some of the key podcasters, people like Eric Weinstein and Sean Carroll, they're sort of physicists that have ended up doing interviews with very high level physicists, and that stuff is very accessible most of the time.
And they're fascinating people and they're fascinating ideas. It's a gift though, that's a gift, but it's also a strategy that our students can work on to know, talk with colleagues, talk with peers, but find the languages to arch beyond yourself.
So here's something I thought of the other day that no one seems to have done. Audio versions of academic papers. Because people have done audio books.
Yes.
But no one has seemingly, as far as I'm aware, recorded audio versions of actual academic papers.
Yes.
Which obviously would be a lot shorter.
Yes.
Do you think, I suppose in the humanities space at least, do you think that would work?
Oh, look, it'd be crucial, and I think it will transform audiobooks. The reason why I think it hasn't occurred, and this is just thinking about the genre of audiobooks, is that people want fiction is done incredibly well, but non-fiction is coming back, self-help is coming back in a big way, bless. But audiobooks have been most normatively 5 to 7 hours of content, immersive content. It can go much longer, but 5 to 7. And so an academic article is 2. And so finding strategies, so for example, Audible only allows you to download 1 freebie a month. Right. So people tend to download 1 biggie and then pay for the rest. So I believe we should be doing that. I'm going to try and do a couple of my zombie university pieces in that way, noting that it will change audiobooks. And the price point on it will be very significant. So if someone's spending $30, which some audiobooks are, for 10 hours of content, the academic article, quite rightly, should probably be at about 99 cents. So it's about getting the price point right and transforming the content.
Yeah. So you do see it as sort of going from whoever you published it with. So say you published it with a journal that they then put it out there. rather than as sort of your own free content?
Oh, look, it's interesting, and have negotiated this literally this week on my book that was accepted on Monday at the Creative PhD. I've negotiated with the publishers, so there's ebook, paperback, hardback, and they're in the contract. So I've asked my publishers, and that was Manchester University Press and Emerald, based in Bingley in Yorkshire, Hardware One in Bingley in Yorkshire, would they release the audio content? So I'm very comfortable for the publisher to nest it in, but most academic publishers at this point have not gone into audio books. So I've said to them, please, we'll do our usual deal about paperback and hardback. If you're not going to use the audio book, can we put that in the contract and you release it to me? And there's a fantastic firm called Authors Republic that take that content, we acknowledge where it was in its written form, and they release it. So all those options are available. But for example, the engagement I've had with Emerald this week about our new book is they're saying, well, look, they are interested in the audio book. And I said, well, look, let's do a deal. Let's put that in the contract. We'll do all the recording, all the editing, get it high quality, and you tell us what you'd like to do with the money and the financial on it. So we're literally at that stage of the party where we're just negotiating. Now with academic articles, a lot of the crew, I only publish open access. So you'd have to be doing the deal with them. Here it is. Are you happy if I do an audio version? The open access they would be. But also if you're working with Taylor and Francis or Springer, they might be less happy to do that. So they're not using the audio content, they might be unhappy about you using it, but you've got to ask the question. So start asking the question.
Yeah. Well, the other way of sort of putting forward shorter form academic content that struck me is recording lectures and putting them up for free on YouTube. I mean, the perfect example of this is someone like Jordan Peterson, who's basically made a whole load of arguments in free access online lectures, which was all out there pretty much, and then published a book saying exactly the same thing, which sold 3 million copies or whatever it was. And so is that sort of potentially the other way, rather than just recording a pure audio version of an academic paper, you could actually film a lecture where you make the same argument?
Yeah, see, my argument has been, and I've developed this one over 20 years. I mean, Jordan Peterson, I can't even breathe. I just might start weeping uncontrollably in front of your audience. So we can maybe return to Peterson at some point, but wow, just take a breath. My argument about media is as follows, that a lecture, and I do a lot of lectures, I do a lot of paid lectures. Lectures are multi-sensory engagements. So they are big, they're written to be delivered for a live audience. So I've always been very clear on, and I know I've lost this battle, by the way, I lost it 20 years ago, but my big belief is lectures are hot and sweaty and multi-sensory and exciting and analog. So in other words, it's the experience, and you know what, we're all sharing this in real time, it's synchronous, and it will never be repeated. When it's over, it's gone. And I love that. Okay, so I did love that. And so when I do asynchronous content, I write it in a different way. So how I deliver my video is very, very different from how I lecture. Very, very different, because it's got different audiences and different purposes and different protocols, different content. It's organised in a different way. So,
but way to record a lecture, would you lecture differently, knowing that it was being recorded?
Oh, absolutely. And I would be, in fact, I have refused to record it, because I've had very few of even my international paid presentations recorded, because it is about me working with the live audience that's with me. And they're very special, and it's gone up to 5,000-6,000 people, and they're there, and they've spent their time off and they've spent their money to be with me. So I don't want to necessarily focus on voice, because when you're doing that, you've got to focus on voice, focus on how you're moving your body, whereas I move my body for an analog, real, synchronous audience in a completely different way, because I'm responding to them, not people behind a lens. That's a different audience. That's a different way of communicating to 5,000 people in front of you.
Yeah.
And so I tailor content for the audience.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the immediate analogy that comes up is TED Talks, which are effectively not proper lectures, but almost lectures.
But very short.
Very short, yeah. But then for someone like Gresham College, for example, in the UK, they film all of their lectures, and they're fantastic. And I'm not sure, and I definitely get your point about the idea of it being almost like kind of like a theatre show, that you go there for the experience.
Yeah.
But the sort of the accessibility argument comes back to me, that you can expand the audience for a really great lecture to so many more people.
Agree. What I would do, and what I have done, is when I've done a big public lecture, I've then recorded it completely separately as a podcast with attention to voice and different audiences. So the content's been slightly changed to move it into an asynchronous audience. But I never ever want to shortchange, because I mean, life is about living in the present, and part of it is if we're in the present and we're doing a lecture, the lecture is a very dignified millennial space that has existed. I mean, if you think about Socrates limping about ancient Athens, the lecture is a very special genre, and it's a very special experience. And I would never cheapen that to record it and flatten it. So it is big and it is bold. Now, I know I've lost that argument, so I lost it 20 years ago. But for me, and these are decisions I personally make, and that's why I'm still paid to do lectures. I'm brought in because it is sweaty and big and exciting, and we leave nothing on the dance floor.
Yeah. Well, I go back to the point that I made at the beginning, that you can get away with bad video. I don't think that, it's like, say you did your lecture completely how you wanted to, how you would normally do it for a live audience.
Yep.
But it just happened to also be recorded, even if it was on a rubbish camera.
Yeah.
I don't think the audience who are watching online would mind at all that content wasn't tailored to video. I think people would be excited that they just had a window, even if it's a tiny little crappy low resolution window, into that world, rather than sort of having to see everything in HD.
Oh, you're funny. But I'm also very hard to video when I'm lecturing too, because I'm up and down. I run. You
have to pay some film study students to sit behind moving the camera around all the time. But
well, that's right. And so I literally do dance. I do all sorts of bonkers things. We get the audience to dance. It's fantastic. We sing. We do all sorts of bonkers things, because it's a one-off moment that we share that'll never be repeated. And of course, the audience engages with it differently if they're not being recorded too. If it's a special moment that'll never be repeated.
Yeah, well, your lectures sound very exciting.
They're interesting. They're interesting, and they're a different genre to what I do on video.
Yeah, no, I do definitely get that. I suppose I repeat the argument of accessibility and just wanting to get all those ideas out there.
Yes.
And maybe you're right. Maybe tailoring those in a different form might be a better way of doing that. Whether it's
which is why, of course, the vlogs existed like they do, because it is tailored, intimate content. Me having a relationship with people through a lens, and the material's written for that audience.
What have you discovered about yourself since starting doing the vlog?
Oh, look, not a lot, because I suppose I had the fortune of coming to this party very, very old. So I was very, very old when I started this, and of course I was fortunate to be in the United Kingdom with all the great things that happened there and so forth. So I think what I discovered is I have a very big private space, and so I'm quite a private person. And my house, you just put your phone there. There's his phone. As you can see, I don't have my phone. I'm just
looking at the time for the record.
Yes, I'm uncontactable, right? So I like that. My house, no one comes into my house. I'm very, very private. So for me, the vlog was about me trying to negotiate what's professional, what's academic, what's personal. And of course, my beloved late husband got sick, got pancreatic cancer, and died during it. And so that's credit. And of course, he kept it. My beloved husband, Professor Steve Redhead, hi to all Steve's friends out there. So Steve wanted his illness. He was dying for 8 months, kept completely secret. So we're alone in Adelaide. I had to look after him. And so that transformed everything. So I couldn't stop the vlogs, because if I stopped it, then people would perhaps know that something was wrong with Steve. So I had to continue basically walking through the vlog series in a living hell until the day he died, and I recorded a vlog the day after he died. And so what I learned, I suppose, about myself is you've got to live by example. So when I'm asking people to make decisions in their life, if I have any sort of mantra of life, it is make a decision. Don't just drift, make a decision. And so life presented me with a series of decisions to make. And hopefully I'm not a hypocrite, and I made some reasonably good decisions sort of moving forward. And so that's what life taught me, is I've got to negotiate the private and the public, and truly dreadful things happen, and you've got to make a decision if you're going to live or die.
Yeah.
And on a daily basis, can I take another breath? Can I be bothered? And so there's a courage in the breath, and there's a courage in waking up the next day and having a go.
Yeah, one of the things you said on one of your blogs is when you're doing a PhD, life still happens.
Oh.
And that you have, whatever happens that goes on, you have to sort of navigate your PhD around all of that stuff.
Yes.
And work it all out.
Yes, exactly. And, as I often say, Steve's life presented great gifts and benefits. His death also did, because one of the saddest things that happens and one of the highest failure rates or attriting rates of PhDs is when someone dies. So our student loses a baby, loses a partner, loses a parent, and they just can't function. And so in some ways, Steve's death allowed me to hold the hands of people around the world where the worst had happened. And together we stepped through that, and students, hundreds of students that faced incredible grief and were just floating in their PhD, were able to finish. And I'll always take great heart from that, and I'm very humbled by that.
Yeah, no, I think it's, from my point of view, it's great to have someone with your level of insight offering that kind of advice and experience in dealing with PhD students as well, of all different sorts.
Yes, and that's, I hope, that the lessons from the office. We're in one of the rooms of the Office of Graduate Research. We call this Scotland because it's upstairs and the crazy people work here. But this is at our Scotland office. And we try to present the stories from the Office of Graduate Research. So we've got the research, it's always research driven, but also it's about the stories and it's about the examples, and maybe it's one sentence that gives someone the impetus to just finish, and that's what matters.
And you've just recorded your 200th blog.
Yes.
How do you see it moving forward?
Oh, look,
What's
I don't know. I don't know. We'll keep going each week. So 201 is being recorded tomorrow morning, and 202 is being written tonight. So it's that sort of production line. But having said that, as I teach our students, every single one of us is one day from another job. So I teach our students to be resilient and agile and be ready to start a new job tomorrow. And that's the nature of the contemporary working environment. And the same rule applies for me. So I don't know what country I'm going to be in a month's time. I don't know what job I'll be in a month's time. And that's exciting and wonderful too. So while I'm in this wonderful job and I love every minute of this job, we'll do one a week. Whatever the future holds, something different, a new medium will emerge, and we'll play with that.
Yeah, I've got to ask you about your morning routine as well, because I thought I was an early bird. I get up when I'm doing well at 4:30, which most people think is utterly insane. But you get up.
I get up at 2.
At 2.
I get up at 2.
When do you go to bed?
Very, very late. So I don't need a lot of sleep. That's why I don't talk about it too much, because I don't want people to think this is remotely a model, because I'm sure I'll be dead soon. Like, will I make it to 55? Uncertain. So don't use this as a model for anything. But actually, I don't need sleep. My brother is the same. My parents are the same. So probably there is a genetic thing there. Don't need a lot of sleep. And I, in this sort of job, need a couple of hours to do my research before the workday starts. So it works very well. I do a couple of hours of my reading and writing, then go to the gym for a couple of hours, then come and do my day's work.
Yeah, I do find it encouraging, the sort of a semi-movement of early birds. People like Jocko Willink getting up, posting a picture of his watch at 4:30 every morning. Yeah. Which is, I think, encouraging, but then you don't want people to be doing it who don't have the genetic predisposition to actually benefit from it.
Oh, they call it extreme larks. They're called extreme larks, which I love as a vibe. And I love it because it also gives me that quietness in the morning. And
it's a great time, isn't it, when nothing's happening? There's absolutely nothing.
I can't explain how wonderful, extraordinary it is to particularly when you're reading and writing, to just sit in your own mind for a couple of hours and see who you are and stretch yourself intellectually to the height that you can go before you come into the minutiae of the workplace.
Yeah, there's nothing going on. No one's posting on Twitter. No one's updated the news sites. No one's uploading anything. Nothing's on TV. It's like a perfect time. Oh,
it is. I would not be who I am without it. I wouldn't be writing and researching without that crucial 2 hours in the morning.
Yeah, I mean, unlike you, I need at least 6 hours though, so do maintain that.
And that's good. That's good. No, I'm no role model for anybody at all.
And so you just published your 19th book?
The 19th book was accepted by publishers on Monday.
Excellent. What's that called?
It's called The Creative PhD. So it's looking at the challenges of creative-led research, but also the artefact exegesis model, which exists in architecture, where you create artefacts, which could be designs, very common in architecture, and the exegesis from the Greek explanation. So that mode of thesis, which has the highest failure rates, very high dropout rate, lots of weird stuff happens there. So I thought, well, let's write a book with Natalie Hills and Tiffany Knight, my former student and our wonderful examination officer here, to provide a supervisor, student and professional staff member perspective about how to get the creative PhD right.
Is the creative PhD, you think, very different to the scientific PhD in the way you manage it? Obviously, the content's different, but the sort of the management systems and methods.
Great question again, Bruce. It is a mode of doctorate. So, in other words, we're now seeing the artefact exegesis thesis move into allied health, particularly, and also into education. So, it seemed at its most obvious, a poet or a filmmaker, so they make a film and here's an exegesis, they write some poetry, they have an exegesis, they write a novel, here's an exegesis, they design a house, here's the exegesis. But we're seeing now, we've got a student in speech pathology who's doing a series of curricular design elements as the series of artefacts, the exegesis. In the sciences, we've got science education, here's a science education curriculum. Here's the exegesis. So it is a mode of thesis, most commonly nested in the arts, the humanities, the creative arts, but as a mode of doctorate is now starting to move through the disciplines.
And I should talk about some of your previous books as well. Which is your favourite of the ridiculously large number of books that you've published?
Yeah, look, I the book I'm known for, so when I die, which hopefully will not be in the next couple of weeks, if I die, it'll be Tara Brabazon, the writer of the University of Google. And I'll always thank the United Kingdom for that, because it was released while I was Professor of Media at the University of Brighton. And it was a tough book. It had incredible publicity. It sold and still continues to sell. It's in its second edition incredibly well around the world. So I'll be known for that. I think my two best books in terms of just me, the book that followed the University of Google, which is Digital Dieting, which is about management of the digital space for learning. So it's a very reflexive, quite beautiful book written on wonky tables and temporary accommodation as I moved from England to Canada, back to England and down to Australia. So it was one of those, I think I moved quite quickly for a few years there, and that book followed me in sort of self-catered accommodation environments and wonky tables. So that's I think probably my best written book. But my favourite that moved me, I suppose, from an Australian academic to an international audience was the book I wrote for Ashgate, which has now been bought by Taylor and Francis Routledge, which was called From Revolution to Revelation. And that book was about my generation, Generation X, cultural studies, and basically how we manage life and living and working in education. So again, in terms of youth studies and post-youth studies, From Revolution to Revelation, again, I'm very fortunate, sold very well and been cited very well.
I'm sure everyone will be able to look up those books.
They're all still available.
Let's end. You mentioned digital dieting. Let's end talking a bit about that. We're in a weird space now. It's the iPhone was invented in 2007.
Yes.
And there's a significant backlash against sort of over immersion, I guess, in technology and smartphones and this kind of thing. How do you see that developing over the next 5 or 10 years?
Yes, let's hope it's research driven, because we're now at a point post the Pew Internet and American Life project, which has been doing longitudinal work for over 20 years in this area. We now have a lot of research that talks about clearly where digitisation and digital platforms are best used, and where they shouldn't be used. And so, for example, we've now got some very important research about early childhood education and when kids should use the immersive screen-based environments and when it should be turned off, and it should be turned off a lot. So I don't want to do scaremongering or weird stuff or go back to some sort of nostalgia or all that sort of stuff. Let's look at the research. Where are the digital platforms well used and where are they not? And we learn to turn off the notifications. When should we turn off the notifications and when should we immerse? And that's, I think, finishing off today, that's really about reinvesting leisure with meaning, because we talk so much about work and 24/7 and phones and work follows us and it's a nightmare. And we've lost leisure, we've lost play. And so what we need to do when we're thinking about digitisation is reconnect it with a positive, productive, scary, wow, wonderful, brilliant leisure. and think about digitisation and leisure, and not so easily slop it into work. Realise that work may involve controlling the digital space and living in the minute, living in the analogue, living in the synchronous, and using digitisation with consciousness, with choice in leisure.
Brilliant. Well, that's a lovely place to end. Can you tell everyone where they can find you on social media, on YouTube?
You can find me everywhere. So just put in Tara, T-A-R-A, Brabazon, that's a bit more challenging, B-R-A-B-A-Z-O-N, and I'm basically on everything, so please come and say hello, love to find you, and it's been brilliant to share this time with you.
And any struggling academics out there, I can highly recommend Tara's channel. It's very insightful and very inspiring, especially at 4 in the morning when you're struggling to do work.
Absolutely, so I'm thrilled, and anything you'd like to say to me, send me an email, find me on Twitter, find me on LinkedIn, find me anywhere, find me on Facebook. Love
Brilliant.
to see you.
Thank you very much, Tara. It's been a wonderful conversation, and good luck with all your work and your vlog in the future.
You're a star. Thank you for being in Adelaide.
Thank you very much.